I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
A man smiles for a photograph, yet when it's developed, he's gone. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallow. This community is amazing. Tell me where you're watching from today. Your comments make this journey come alive. Let's begin. The guests at Lord Willoughby's autumn weekend party had gathered in the great oak-panelled drawing room of Ashcombe Hall, a place where every gilt-framed portrait and every silver candelabrum whispered of old money and carefully maintained appearances. A fire crackled in the hearth, shadows dancing against the tall windows where the rain fell in sheets. It was a moment preserved in elegance. Champagne glasses half raised, a string quartet drifting through a waltz from the far end of the room, the air perfumed with roses and cigar smoke. At the heart of this tableau stood Charles Armitage, a man of 40 with the polished charm of a diplomat and the calculating eyes of one who enjoyed being observed. He was posing, most willingly, before the lens of Lady Willoughby's new camera, a marvel of modern contraption. "Hold still, Charles." Lady Willoughby laughed, her pearls trembling at her throat as she adjusted the focus. "I want this to be just perfect, a keepsake of tonight." There was the flash, a brilliant burst of magnesium powder. The company clapped in amusement. Armitage bowed with theatrical gallantry, and then, as the smoke cleared, a murmur began to ripple through the room. The photograph, when developed only an hour later in the little dark room off the gallery, showed the entire company gathered about the hearth. Lady Willoughby, her niece Eleanor in pale silk, Colonel Godfrey with his stiff moustache, Mrs. Latimer with her ever-watchful eyes. Even the butler discreetly in the background. Everyone except Charles Armitage. Where he had stood, the space was empty. The image spread among the guests with nervous laughter at first, perhaps a technical error, perhaps the gentleman had shifted just as the flash went off. But then whispers grew darker. For when the party was to retire, Charles Armitage was nowhere to be found. His room lay untouched, his luggage unopened, his walking stick still leaning against the stand in the hall. The butler swore he had not left by the main doors. The servants attested that no carriage had been ordered. The house was searched from the garret to the wine cellars, yet no trace of him remained. By morning, fear had taken root in Ashcombe Hall. The gentleman had not merely stepped out into the storm, he had, as the photograph foretold, vanished. Rain hashed at the windows until the panes seemed to shiver with each gust, and the hall grew hushed in that particular way grand houses do when fear has wandered from room to room and taken possession of the servants' whispers. Lady Willoughby stood very straight in the gallery, beneath the grim portrait of her late husband, one hand resting at her pearls, the other holding the offending photograph in its paper sleeve. What had been a diverting novelty now felt like an omen. She rang for the guests with the little handbell that once summoned music, and they came quickly, drawn by anxiety as much as by habit. Eleanor arrived first, her pale silk exchanged for a sober wool dress hastily buttoned askew. She had spent the small hours walking the corridor outside Charles Armitage's door, or so she said. The maid confirmed the light had shone beneath the threshold and never moved. Eleanor's eyes were red but dry. She twisted a handkerchief until it remembered the shape of her fingers and avoided the colonel's gaze. Colonel Godfrey entered with the square-shouldered energy of a man who prefers orders to questions. He had been at cards with Mrs. Latimer in the smoking room until just before midnight, when the flash and laughter had set the house abuzz. He professed distrust of photographic contraptions, trifles, he called them, yet he inspected the print with an odd intent fascination, as though it were a map revealing a route he had somehow missed. Mrs. Latimer followed in a rustle of black crepe that was too modish for mourning and too costly for discretion. She was the sort of widow to whom tragedy had made an ally of elegance. Her hands were beautiful and always busy, smoothing a cuff, aligning the sugar tongs, touching the locket at her throat. She inquired after Charles with appropriate concern, and then, in the gentle way of women who know how to listen, asked whether his luggage had truly remained unopened. When told it had, she breathed out a soft "ah" that might have been sympathy and might have been calculation. The butler, Finch, stood at the door with the gravity of a verger. His account did not vary. Mr. Armitage had not passed the front steps. No motor had approached. The staff had been occupied with trays and lamps and the sudden demand for developer in the dark room. Finch disliked improvisation and did not attempt it now. Yet once, when he glanced toward the staircase, his Adam's apple rose and fell as though he had swallowed a truth that did not agree with him. Also present was Lionel Vane, a young man with an aggressively casual tie and the long fingers of an idler who has never quite earned his keep. He had arrived that afternoon as a friend of Eleanor's from London, an artist of sorts, though of what sort he never quite said. He had been the one to enthuse over Lady Willoughby's camera, to suggest the group be arranged like a Botticelli, but English, and to insist Charles take centre place. Now he seemed oppressed by the success of his composition. At the periphery hovered Dr. Ambrose Keene, the village physician, summoned at dawn under the pretext that someone might faint. He examined no one, but he peered at the photograph with the professional curiosity of a man used to bodies that misbehave. He asked when the plate had been developed and by whom. Lady Willoughby answered that Lionel, clever with chemicals and determined to be helpful, had taken charge while Finch fetched more water. Dr. Keene nodded, and one could almost see the tidy compartments in his mind rearranging themselves to accommodate a new possibility. "I shall not have panic," Lady Willoughby said at last, in the tone with which she could quiet an orchestra. "Mr. Armitage is absent. He may have gone out on some errand of his own. Until we know otherwise, we will behave with order." "Order, yes," murmured Mrs. Latimer. "But what of prudence? If Mr. Armitage has enemies, does he?" Eleanor's question came too swift, too sharp, as if it pricked her. Colonel Godfrey gave a grunt. "Armitage is a speculator. Speculators make enemies as other men make acquaintances. Half the city would like to see the back of him." "Half, Colonel?" Lionel managed a rueful smile. "Not a cheerful estimate." "Half his charity," the Colonel replied. The photograph passed from hand to hand. Each observed what suited conscience. Eleanor saw only the empty hearthrug and wavered. Mrs. Latimer noted that Finch, blurred in the background, had one hand on the decanter when she could have sworn both had been politely folded. Lionel frowned that the chair to Charles's right seemed closer than he remembered placing it. The doctor, who liked puzzles, observed that Eleanor's necklace clasp faced front in the image when, in the drawing-room at that instant, it lay properly at the nape. "Someone altered the arrangement after the flash," he said mildly. "Or before it." "Before," Lady Willoughby repeated. "The clasp would not migrate of its own accord," Dr. Keene said, "unless the photograph lies." "Photographs do not lie," Lionel protested, and colored, for he of all men might know how easily truth is coaxed in a dark room. The house was searched again, this time with the steadier light of morning. The attic yielded trunks that held the brittle scent of camphor and summers long gone. The cellars offered only bottles and the reassurance that, though England feared shortages, Ashcombe would not be the first to suffer them. In the small museum of the library, the late Lord Willoughby's collection of Roman coins and local curiosities, Eleanor lingered before a case containing a lead token stamped with a vanished emperor's profile, as though ancient absences might explain a modern one. In Charles's room, nothing had been disturbed. His shirts lay like folded arguments. A book on the bedside table presented itself face down as though interrupted mid-sentence. The window was latched. The grate was cold. Finch reported, in tone scratched by dignity, that the servant's stairs had been watched all night by his juniors, who had discovered nothing more suspicious than Lionel singing a fragment of music hall while returning from the dark room. Lionel blushed and said it steadied his nerves. By noon, the party had thinned to a tense core that clung to the drawing room because leaving it would have looked like flight. Lady Willoughby ordered luncheon laid, but no one ate. Finch announced that Mr. Armitage's walking stick, which had leaned all evening in the hall, was gone. This news, small as it was, ruptured the fragile poise of the company. The Colonel swore softly. Eleanor's composure faltered into a sick little laugh. Mrs. Latimer lowered her eyes as if a private expectation had been met. "We must send for someone," Lady Willoughby said, and for the first time her pearls stilled at her throat. "Not the local constable. This is not a missing umbrella." Dr. Keene coughed. "If I may, madam. There is in London a gentleman of a certain reputation, a foreigner but discreet. He has a gift for sorting human muddles without making a public spectacle." Eleanor lifted her head, hope and caution struggling in her face. Lionel muttered that artists preferred mysteries unsolved. The Colonel, who distrusted all foreigners equally, nonetheless inclined his head. Mrs. Latimer's busy hands went still. "Send for him," Lady Willoughby said. "At once." And so, as the rain slackened into a fine, persistent mist, a telegram was composed in the blue morning room, where the writing desk looked out upon the sodden rose garden. Finch carried it to the bicycle he maintained for necessary errands and, though he disliked exertion, pedalled with unusual vigor toward the village post. The message was brief and without embroidery, because that is how true distress writes. Gentleman vanished at Ashcombe Hall after photographic sitting stop. Circumstances, most peculiar, stop immediate assistance entreated. On his way out, Finch passed Lionel in the passage, the young man wiping his stained fingers as though the developer still clung to them. In the smoking room, Mrs. Latimer recounted, for the Colonel's ears or for her own, that she had once known a man who disappeared between a carriage step and a platform. "A simple miscalculation," she said, "and all his debts went with him." Eleanor stood at the window and watched the mist draw a veil across the roses, as if the earth itself preferred not to witness whatever human arrangement had failed in the night. By afternoon, the rain had spent itself. Ashcombe Hall dried into a brittle brightness that made every contradiction stand out in stronger lines. The company waited, each in the posture that best disguised impatience. In the silence that gathered like dust, a motor car could be heard long before it reached the gates, its engine a neat foreign purr that sounded, to certain ears, like the approach of judgment. The motor car rolled up the drive, its polished bonnet catching the pale gleam of afternoon, and the crunch of its tires on the gravel brought the household to the windows. It came to a brisk halt beneath the portico, and a figure stepped out with measured precision, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate grey suit before he accepted his hat from the driver. A slight man with an egg-shaped head perfectly balanced upon his shoulders and a moustache so finely tended it seemed almost a proclamation, Hercule Poirot ascended the steps of Ashcombe Hall. His shoes gleamed despite the damp, his gait was measured, and his eyes sharp, curious, and already appraising the symmetry of the house, missed nothing. Finch opened the door with solemnity, and Poirot was ushered into the drawing-room where the uneasy assembly waited. Lady Willoughby advanced to greet him, and though her manner was gracious, her relief was unmistakable. She presented her guests in turn, her voice steady but her eyes darting with anxiety, as though she feared to betray too much. Poirot inclined his head to each with polite formality, yet when he looked at them, he seemed to weigh them as one might weigh a coin, testing not the appearance, but the sound of the metal beneath. He listened quietly as Lady Willoughby recounted the peculiar circumstances, the group photograph, the empty space where Charles Armitage had stood, and the disappearance discovered soon after. Poirot nodded once, steepling his fingertips, and when the photograph itself was placed in his hands, he held it with reverence, as though it were a relic. He examined it closely, bringing it nearer to the light, tilting it one way and another, and finally tapping the image with his forefinger. "'Tis curious, this absence," he murmured. Curious indeed. A man of flesh and blood who is seen by all, and then, poof, he is gone. In the photograph, in the house. Both. They agree together. Very well. We shall see. The company watched him uneasily. Mrs. Latimer's hands worried at her locket. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed upon him, almost imploringly. Colonel Godfrey frowned, his moustache bristling at the presence of a foreigner taking command. Lionel, lounging with studied nonchalance, offered Poirot a cigarette, which was declined with a smile and a delicate gesture of the hand. Poirot preferred order even in his indulgences, and Lionel's case, with its jumbled assortment, was chaos itself. "Now," Poirot said, his voice soft but carrying, "each of you will tell me of last evening, from the beginning of the dinner until the hour when Mr. Armitage was last seen. Do not be afraid to repeat what has already been said, for it is in the repetition that the little discrepancies reveal themselves." Lady Willoughby began, describing the dinner and the mood of gaiety that had pervaded the drawing-room when the camera was brought out. Poirot listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a bon or a slight nod, his gaze steady on her face. When Eleanor spoke, her account trembled with emotion. She confessed she had found Charles animated during the evening, almost too much so, his charm slightly overbright, as though he performed for an invisible audience. Poirot's eyes softened at her distress, but he said, nothing beyond a thoughtful, "Ah, mademoiselle." The colonel, when questioned, was blunt. He had thought little of Armitage, whom he considered a trifler, a man too smooth to be trusted. He had played cards with Mrs. Latimer until nearly midnight, and then retired, leaving Charles still in the drawing-room. Poirot raised his brows at the word "retired," but did not press the matter. Mrs. Latimer, when her turn came, folded her hands gracefully and spoke in tones of gentle reason. She admitted she had never much liked Armitage, though she pitied him, for he seemed a man who gathered friends quickly but kept none long. She could not account for his absence except to suppose that he had chosen to leave abruptly, perhaps compelled by some urgent private matter. Poirot watched her closely as she spoke, noting the careful choice of words, the little pauses where her memory seemed too exact. Lionel's account was scattered with flourishes. He described the composition of the photograph in detail, his own role in arranging it, his eagerness to see the plate developed. He claimed to have gone at once to the dark room, where he worked until the strange discovery emerged. Poirot asked him to describe the process, step by step, and Lionel obliged, though his recollections were punctuated by sighs of impatience, as though he found the inquiry tiresome. Poirot's questions, however, grew sharper, and Lionel shifted in his chair, his casual air beginning to fray. Finally, Finch was called. The butler stood with his hands folded, his expression one of dignified endurance. He repeated his assertion that Mr. Armitage had not left by the main doors, nor had any vehicle been summoned. He confirmed that the luggage remained untouched, and that no servant had seen or heard his departure. Poirot regarded him for a long moment, then thanked him courteously, but his moustache twitched as though he had registered something more than was said. When all had spoken, Poirot rose, the photograph still in his hand. He walked to the hearth, where the fire had burned low, and placed the image upon the mantel, leaning it against a porcelain clock. He stood before it with his head inclined, studying it as one might a painting, until the silence grew uncomfortable. Then he turned back to the room. "My friends," he said gently, "it is clear that Monsieur Armitage has vanished in a manner most remarkable. But I do not believe in the impossible. There is a reason, always a reason, and it lies not in the camera, nor in the storm, but in the hearts and minds of those who were present." His gaze swept over them, and each felt it linger. Mrs. Latimer's lashes lowered. Eleanor gripped her handkerchief tighter. The colonel scowled. Lionel shifted. Finch remained impassive. Poirot smiled faintly. "We shall proceed with order, with method. First, the house will be searched again, but this time under my direction. Nothing is too small, nothing too trivial. A man does not simply dissolve into the air. And then, he tapped the side of his head, we shall employ the little grey cells. And so, under his instruction, the company scattered once more through Ashcombe Hall. Poirot moved among them, not hurried, but precise, noting the way Eleanor lingered by the window as though awaiting someone, how Mrs. Latimer's eyes darted always toward the staircase, how Lionel avoided the dark room with elaborate casualness. He examined Armitage's room with care, his fingers brushing over the neat stack of shirts, the closed book on the table, the walking stick now conspicuously absent. He paused at the grate, crouched low, and studied a trace of ash that seemed too fine, too white for ordinary coal. He said nothing, merely tucked the observation into the neat compartments of his mind. By the time the search concluded, the daylight was already beginning to fade, and the house seemed once more to close around its occupants like a great, uneasy chest. Poirot reassembled them in the drawing-room, his manner courteous but commanding. "You see," he said softly, "it is not only a disappearance we investigate. It is the presence also, the presence of secrets, of concealments, of human folly. These, mes amis, leave traces far more revealing than footprints on a carpet. They are written here." He tapped his temple lightly. "We shall find them, you and I." The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and though no one spoke, the unspoken weighed heavily. Somewhere within Ashcombe Hall, among the polished silver and the portraits staring down, lay the truth of Charles Armitage's vanishing, and Hercule Poirot had already begun to uncover the threads that would lead to it. The company shifted uneasily in their seats as Poirot regarded them with that calm, penetrating gaze which seemed to see not merely the faces before him, but the small, concealed truths that lay beneath. The fire in the grate gave a sharp crack, sending sparks into the air, and it was to this little outburst of energy that Poirot inclined his head, as though it had confirmed something in his private reasoning. He clasped his hands neatly, the fingers steepled, and spoke in his deliberate manner. "Now, mes amis, the time has come for the questions that are a little more exact. We have heard the accounts of last night. Bon. But you understand, it is not only the words that matter, it is the silences, the pauses. That which is omitted is often louder than that which is confessed. And so, permit me, I shall begin anew, with the details you thought too small to mention." His first inquiry was directed to Eleanor, whose pale hands clutched her handkerchief so tightly the linen seemed in danger of tearing. "Mademoiselle, you say that you remained in the corridor near Monsieur Armitage's room until late. Tell me, in those long minutes, you heard no sound, no movement?" Eleanor shook her head quickly, then hesitated. I thought once, very late, perhaps 12:30, that I heard a creak, as though a door were opened or closed somewhere along the passage. But when I listened, all was silent again. I persuaded myself I had imagined it." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but the imagination, it is a thing most inconvenient, is it not? Yet it has the habit of springing from something real, even when we do not at once understand it. You will forgive me, mademoiselle, if I say that this little creak may be more valuable than you think." He turned next to Colonel Godfrey, who sat upright in his chair as though before a court-martial. "Colonel, you tell me you retired after your card game. You are a man of habit, I see it. You polish your boots until they shine. You fold your handkerchief in squares, not in triangles. Such a man does not deviate from his custom. Tell me, did you pass the corridor of Monsieur Armitage's room on your way upstairs?" The colonel grunted. "Naturally. My room is at the far end, but the hall was empty, quiet as the grave. I saw no one. And yet the boots, they squeak a little, do they not? When you walk, one step, squeak. The other, silent. This I observed when you entered the room." Poirot smiled gently. "So, if the colonel passed, and the young lady heard a creak, we must ask ourselves, was it the colonel she heard, or someone else? Always, you see, it is the details. Mrs. Latimer gave a little laugh, low and musical as though to dissipate the tension. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, are you not chasing phantoms? A creak of a floorboard, the squeak of a boot. These are slender things on which to hang a man's life." "Slender, madame?" Poirot raised a finger. "Mais non. They are the threads with which the tapestry is woven. If one is loose, the whole picture shifts." His gaze rested on her a moment longer than necessary, and she lowered her eyes, her lashes veiling a thought she did not intend to share. Lionel, meanwhile, attempted to reclaim the air of careless charm. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and declared, "If you ask me, Monsieur Poirot, the only thing worth considering is the photograph itself. It is proof. Charles was not there, at least not when the shutter clicked. Perhaps he never stood with us at all. Perhaps we only imagined it. Mass hysteria, they call it. Wouldn't that be delicious?" Poirot regarded him coolly. "You are an artist, Monsieur Lionel. You know well that the eye may deceive, that light and shadow play their tricks. Yet you handled the development of the plate yourself, n'est-ce pas? Alone, in the dark room." Lionel shifted slightly. "Yes, but Finch brought the water. The process was flawless, I swear it. I would stake my reputation on it." "Reputation, yes," Poirot murmured. "But reputation, it is not always the same as honesty. I make no accusation, I merely observe." His mustache twitched, and he let the matter rest, though Lionel's face colored. Poirot rose then, and moved slowly about the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He examined the curtains, the arrangement of the chairs, even the ashtrays upon the side table. Finally, he paused before Finch, who stood discreetly at attention near the door. "Finch," Poirot said softly, "you are a man devoted to order. I see it in every line of your face, and yet you swallow as though something in your throat does not go down. You have told us already that no one left by the front entrance. Très bien. But tell me, are there other ways by which one might depart unseen?" The butler hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering. "There are the terrace doors, sir, leading to the rose garden. But they are heavy, seldom used in winter, and I myself secured them before dinner. I found them bolted again in the morning." Poirot's eyes narrowed with satisfaction. "Bolted again. And you are certain you, yourself, performed this duty?" "Yes, sir, quite certain." "Then it is curious," Poirot replied gently. "For when I examined the floor of the rose garden beneath those very doors, I observed a small scatter of damp soil, such as clings to the heel of a shoe when the ground is wet. Not much, only a trace. But enough to suggest passage." A murmur ran through the company, Eleanor paling visibly, Mrs. Latimer's hands tightening around her locket, Lionel attempting to laugh and finding no voice for it. Colonel Godfrey cleared his throat, his mustache bristling. "Are you suggesting, sir, that Armitage left of his own accord?" Poirot lifted a hand. "Suggesting? No, mon colonel, I do not suggest. I ask questions. Always the questions. Whether Monsieur Armitage left willingly, or whether another guided his steps, that is what we must discover." The clock upon the mantel chimed the quarter hour. Poirot turned once more to the photograph, leaning against the porcelain clock. He lifted it, studied it afresh, and then, with a sudden movement, pressed it flat against the surface of the mantelpiece, aligning it with some invisible measure. "Regardez," he said softly. "See how the chair here? It shifts just a little, too close to the hearth. The arrangement is not natural. Someone moved it, if only by an inch. Why? That is the question." He replaced the photograph carefully, then resumed his seat. His gaze traveled across each face, lingering long enough to draw discomfort, but never long enough to be challenged. At last, he folded his hands and gave a small, satisfied nod. "The truth, mes amis. It does not remain hidden forever. It peeps out in the smallest of places, in the creak of a floorboard, in the trace of ash in a grate, in the soil upon a carpet, in the shift of a chair. Already I begin to see the pattern, though it is faint. We shall proceed with patience. The next step. It is simple. I must learn not only who Monsieur Armitage was in this house, but what he was to each of you. For in your relations, with him lie the motives, and in the motives lies the key. The silence that followed was taut as a wire, each guest suddenly conscious of how their own connection to the vanished man might appear beneath the scrutiny of those piercing grey-green eyes. Poirot leaned back, the faintest smile curving his moustache, and in that moment, though nothing had yet been revealed, it was clear to all that the little Belgian had already begun to unravel their secrets, thread by thread. Poirot allowed the silence to linger, his head tilted ever so slightly, as though listening to the unspoken. Then, with a delicate clearing of his throat, he leaned forward, fingertips pressed together, and began. We must, mes amis, speak frankly of Monsieur Armitage, who he was to each of you, what bond tied you together. It is not the general portrait of the man that interests me, but the little individual brushstrokes that compose the whole. We begin with you, madame. His eyes settled gently upon Mrs. Latimer. She raised her chin, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. I scarcely knew him. We encountered each other at Lady Willoughby's dinners. He was charming, to be sure, but I confess I never thought of him with great seriousness. She clasped her hands together in her lap, fingers entwining and disentangling in restless rhythm. He spoke often of business ventures, schemes, really, if I may say so without offense. But such things are not my interest. I imagine he found me dull. Poirot inclined his head. And yet, madame, it is curious that in your locket, which you touch so often, there is space for a miniature portrait. Empty, perhaps, or once occupied. Mrs. Latimer's eyes flashed, then quickly softened into a laugh that rang a little too bright. You are observant indeed, Monsieur Poirot. It was once my late husband's picture. I have not replaced it, that is all. Poirot said nothing further, but his gaze lingered as though committing her evasion to memory. He turned next to Colonel Godfrey, whose moustache bristled under scrutiny. And you, Colonel? You spoke of Monsieur Armitage as a speculator, a man disliked, yet dislike it is often born of something more precise. What was the nature of your acquaintance? The Colonel shifted. Armitage was a man who meddled in affairs he didn't understand. He fancied himself a financier. Last year he tried to involve me in some South American venture. Railways, mines, I forget the details. I told him plainly I would have none of it. I've seen too many men ruined by promises of quick fortune. His voice sharpened. He took it ill. Called me an old fool before half the smoking room. I never forgave him that insolence. A quarrel, then. Poirot's tone was mild. But no reconciliation. None. And I'm glad of it. Ah, Poirot said softly. Yet you sat down to cards with him not 2 nights past, yes? The Colonel stiffened. I played cards with Mrs. Latimer. Armitage came and went. Poirot's mustache twitched, but he moved on. Mademoiselle Eleanor? You, I think, were perhaps closest to Monsieur Armitage. Will you tell us of your friendship? Her hands trembled upon her lap, and she forced herself to meet his gaze. I admired him. Everyone did. He was clever, witty, a man who seemed to know the world. He spoke of travel, of places I shall never see. He promised once to show me the pyramids of Egypt. She faltered, color draining from her face. But I was not his confidant. I think he had secrets, things he never told anyone. Sometimes he would be very still, as though listening to some inner voice, and then, in an instant, he would laugh and charm us all again. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Did you ever fear him, mademoiselle? She hesitated, then whispered, once. She did not elaborate, but her lips pressed tight, and Poirot, after studying her a moment, did not press further. Lionel was already shifting in his seat, eager to cast his version before suspicion settled too long upon others. As for me, I barely knew the fellow. He struck me as the sort of man who lives by performance, always in the spotlight, always arranging the scene as though he were the central figure. Perhaps it was fitting that in the photograph he vanished, an actor exiting the stage, leaving us bewildered. Poirot smiled faintly. An artist's interpretation, eh? But tell me, Monsieur Lionel, you arranged the group for the photograph. You placed Monsieur Armitage at the center. Why him? Why not? Lionel shrugged. He liked the attention, and compositionally, he fit the symmetry. His tone grew defensive. Surely you don't think I arranged it for any darker reason. Poirot's gaze was steady, his words precise. It is always wise, monsieur, to ask oneself, when one chooses the center of a picture, does one also choose the center of a drama? Lionel gave a short laugh, but no one joined him. Poirot now addressed Finch, who had remained in his place with quiet dignity. And you, mon ami, the butler, you see what others do not. Tell me, how did Monsieur Armitage behave towards you? Finch considered. Polite enough, sir, but not kind. There is a difference. He would forget my name, though I had served him 6 times. He was the sort of gentleman who noticed silverware more than people. Forgive me for speaking so plain. Poirot inclined his head gravely. On the contrary, Finch, to speak plain, it is sometimes the greatest service one may render. Having gathered their words, Poirot rose, his manner calm but his eyes alight with thought. He walked again to the mantel, fingers brushing the photograph as though it breathed. Then he turned back. You see, mes amis, what emerges is not only a man who vanished, but a man who inspired in others strong feeling, dislike, admiration, resentment, perhaps even fear. And where there are such feelings, there also may be motives. You begin to understand, yes? The disappearance, it is not an accident, it is an act, and acts, they have reasons. The company stirred, Eleanor pale, Mrs. Latimer tight-lipped, the Colonel glaring, Lionel restless, Finch impassive. Poirot's voice grew softer, almost musing. There is in this house a secret, one that binds Monsieur Armitage to each of you in ways not yet revealed. It is there, hidden in the silences, in the little gestures, in the words not spoken, and already I begin to see where the shadow falls. The fire flared suddenly, casting long, distorted figures upon the walls. Poirot's eyes flicked toward them, then back to the guests. We shall continue, mes amis. Step by step, detail by detail. And presently you will see, as I see, that the gentleman who vanished from the photograph has not truly disappeared. He remains among us, in your stories, in your fears, in your motives. It is only for me to uncover which of you holds the final piece that explains all. The room was heavy with silence, each person aware that the net of questions had tightened around them. Poirot's gaze swept once more across their faces, and though his smile was faint, it carried with it the weight of inevitability. He had set the board, and now, one by one, their secrets would be played into the open. The silence that followed Poirot's declaration was taut as wire, stretched across the drawing room until it threatened to snap. The fire, burning low, filled the void with occasional sighs, and the clock upon the mantel ticked with an unnerving precision, as though measuring out the distance between revelation and exposure. Poirot, seated with his small figure poised in impeccable composure, allowed the silence to breathe. He had learned long ago that silence was itself an instrument. It drew out the nerves, coaxed forth the smallest betrayals in a gesture, a shifting glance, the involuntary tightening of a hand upon the arm of a chair. At last, it was Eleanor who broke. She rose suddenly, her chair scraping against the polished floor, and her words came in a rush. It is cruel to speak of him so, as though he were already condemned. Charles is not a criminal. He cannot be. If he has vanished, it must be because something dreadful has befallen him, not because of anything he did or any secret you imagine. Her voice trembled, and she seemed on the verge of tears. Poirot looked up at her gently. Mademoiselle, it is not cruelty. It is truth. And to find Monsieur Armitage, alive or dead, we must know the whole of it. Believe me, I wish for no more than that he should walk through that door and explain to us all his strange absence. But until that moment comes, we must seek with the reason, not with the heart. Eleanor's lips pressed tight, but she sank once more into her chair, her knuckles white around the handkerchief. Poirot let his gaze linger upon her for only a moment before turning it elsewhere, as though to spare her further torment. "Colonel Godfrey," he said with quiet authority, "you tell us you quarreled with Monsieur Armitage. This is plain. But tell me, last night at cards, how did he appear? Jovial, distracted, uneasy?" The colonel frowned, his memory unwilling but precise. Uneasy. He lost heavily, too heavily for a man who made a point of boasting of his fortune. His hand shook once or twice when he laid down his cards, and when he left us, he muttered something under his breath I couldn't catch. I thought it the grumblings of a bad loser. Now I'm not so sure. Poirot nodded. "Ah, yes. The mask of gaiety. It slips when money is at stake. It reveals the crack beneath." "Bon. And you, madame?" His eyes returned to Mrs. Latimer. "When you spoke of Monsieur Armitage, you said he was a man who gathered friends quickly but kept them none too long. This is the observation of one who has watched with attention. Tell me, what was it that made you so cautious?" Mrs. Latimer's fingers found her locket once more. "Because I have seen such men before, Monsieur Poirot. They are all charm at the outset, but their attentions shift with the season. They borrow what cannot be returned, affection, confidence, sometimes money. I never allowed him to entangle me in any of it. But others—" Her eyes flicked almost imperceptibly toward Eleanor. "Others may not have been so fortunate." Eleanor gasped, her cheeks flushing crimson. "How dare you?" she cried. "You imply—" Poirot raised his hand. "Softly, softly, mesdames. We do not accuse, we inquire. Mademoiselle Eleanor, do not trouble yourself. The truth, it will not be spoken by insult, but revealed by logic." Lionel, who had been fidgeting with his cigarette case, snapped it open and shut. "All of this is melodrama. You are spinning shadows, Poirot. The fact is simple. Charles Armitage is gone. Perhaps he slipped away of his own will. Perhaps he wished to disappear. There are men who do that, you know. Reinvent themselves, begin again elsewhere. If he were in debt or in some private trouble, is it not likely he chose this moment to vanish?" Poirot's eyes sparkled. "You are quick to provide explanations, Monsieur Lionel, and yet explanations, they are like smoke. One must see what fire they conceal. Tell me, when you handled the photograph in the dark room, you were alone for some time?" Lionel's smile faltered. "Yes, but I have told you, the process was flawless. There was no trick." "Perhaps not a trick," Poirot said softly, "but perhaps an accident, a carelessness." He let the suggestion hang, and Lionel flushed, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. It was Finch, quiet until now, who spoke in his steady voice. "If I may, sir. I did not see Mr. Armitage leave, but when I passed through the west corridor after midnight, I noticed something unusual. The window at the far end, it was ajar, only slightly, but enough to admit the rain. I closed it, thinking nothing of it, but now—" All eyes turned to him, and Poirot's face brightened with interest. "Mon brave Finch, you are precise, you note the detail. And this corridor, it leads where?" "To the smaller terrace, sir, behind the orangery." Poirot leaned back, satisfaction curling at the edges of his moustache. "Ah, then it is most intriguing. We have the bolted doors to the rose garden, and yet traces of soil there. And now another exit, briefly open to the storm. It seems Monsieur Armitage, or someone else, had reason to test the boundaries of this house." Eleanor shuddered. "Then he may have gone into the night after all, into the rain, with no hat, no coat. That is madness." "Perhaps," Poirot replied. "Or perhaps it was desperation, or—" His eyes flicked to each guest in turn. Perhaps it was contrived by another hand. You see, the disappearance is like the photograph itself, a space left empty, but the objects around it, they tell the story of what once stood there. He rose suddenly, his movements graceful, and went to the window, drawing aside the heavy curtain. Outside, the mist clung to the garden, blurring the hedges and trees into indistinct forms. Poirot gazed out for a moment, then let the curtain fall. Tomorrow, when the ground is drier, we shall see what footprints, if any, remain near this orangery. For now, we must rely upon what is within, your words, your glances, your little betrayals. The fire spat again, and the tension thickened. Poirot turned back to the room, his voice lower, almost intimate. There is something here, mes amis, a piece of the puzzle that does not fit. Monsieur Armitage did not vanish into the air. He was made to vanish. Whether by his own will or another's, we shall discover. But one thing I promise you, the photograph, it does not lie. It tells us not only who was present, but who wished another absent, and in that wish there is motive. Soon we shall uncover it. The company sat frozen, each lost in their own uneasy reflections. Eleanor stared down at her lap, fighting tears. Mrs. Latimer's hands tightened once more on her locket, her knuckles white. The colonel glowered into the fire, his jaw set hard. Lionel shifted, restless, his cigarette case opening and snapping shut like a nervous tick. Finch, steady as ever, looked straight ahead, though the lines of his face seemed carved deeper by knowledge he had not yet spoken. Poirot resumed his seat, calm and composed, but his eyes glittered with the certainty of a man who had begun to trace the invisible pattern. Step by step, the web tightened, and each of them, though they scarcely dared admit it, felt the invisible threads drawing closer around their own secrets. The atmosphere of Ashcombe Hall thickened as the afternoon dwindled into dusk. The mist outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the lamps within burned with a kind of strained brightness, as though they too felt the tension of the household. Poirot, serene amidst the unease, remained a fixed point, his posture immaculate, his eyes alive with the delicate gleam of thought. He had gathered much, and though he revealed little, each guest sensed that already his mind had begun to arrange the puzzle in its quiet compartments. He spoke at last, his voice soft yet cutting through the stillness. You see, mes amis, the matter divides itself into two possibilities. Either Monsieur Armitage departed of his own accord, in which case we must ask why, and why in so strange a manner, or else he was assisted, compelled, perhaps even prevented from departing in the ordinary way. Each of you holds a fragment of this truth, whether you know it or not, and so we must look not only to the corridors and the doors, but to the histories that bind you together. For in the heart of a man's past lies the seed of his present fate. His gaze drifted deliberately toward Mrs. Latimer, who met it with a controlled smile, her hands never leaving the locket that seemed now almost an extension of her being. Madame, you spoke of having seen such men as Armitage before, men who charm and then abandon. But tell me, was it only suspicion you felt, or was there more? Did he perhaps attempt to persuade you of some investment, to use your name, your standing? For a moment her composure trembled, but she mastered it. He spoke of ventures, yes. He spoke to many, but I gave him nothing. No money, no endorsement. My caution was intact. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. And yet there is always a cost, even in saying no. Resentment, disappointment. These things linger. They are debts of another kind. Colonel Godfrey gave a grunt. Debts. That is all Armitage ever had to his name. He was a parasite, feeding on the gullible. I told you, Poirot, I'd no patience for him. Poirot's mustache twitched in faint amusement. And yet, mon colonel, you played cards with him, knowing his character. Why? Because though you despised him, still he tempted you, eh? To beat such a man at his own game, it gives satisfaction. The colonel stiffened, but made no reply. Poirot turned now to Lionel, who had lit a cigarette and was exhaling smoke with affected languor. "And you, Monsieur Lionel, you speak of him as though he were merely a figure on a stage, an actor, a performer. But tell me, was it not you who persuaded Lady Willoughby to purchase this camera, who urged the photograph, who placed him at the center of the group? You have the eye for composition, yes, but also, did you not also have the desire to see him fixed in such a position?" Lionel laughed lightly, though there was tension beneath. "You make me sound like a conspirator. It was nothing more than artistic instinct. He enjoyed the attention. I obliged him. What of it?" "Perhaps nothing," Poirot said softly. "Perhaps everything. For in arranging the stage, one also arranges the drama, and you, mon ami, are very conscious of the dramatic." Eleanor shifted in her seat, her voice breaking in with sudden fervor. "Must you twist everything into suspicion? He was not a villain. If he had faults, they were only the faults of brilliance. He promised me a future. He spoke of a life beyond this narrow circle, beyond Ashcombe, beyond England. You cannot understand what that meant to me." Poirot looked at her with deep compassion, but his words were firm. "Ah, mademoiselle, I understand very well, but a promise, it is a dangerous thing. It binds one heart, and it may threaten another. To one person, it is hope. To another, it is betrayal. Remember that." Eleanor flushed scarlet and dropped her gaze, clutching her handkerchief as though it might shield her from the scrutiny of the others. Finch, who had kept his silence through much of this, now cleared his throat with quiet dignity. "Monsieur Poirot, if I may, there is something further. Last night, when I closed the house, I passed by the gallery where Lady Willoughby keeps her collection of photographs. One frame was disturbed. The dust showed it had been lifted, though when I looked, it was replaced. This morning, I checked again. It is a photograph taken years ago, of Mr. Armitage, I believe, in company with gentlemen I did not recognize. I cannot say what it means, but it struck me as odd." Poirot's eyes lit with keen interest. "Très bien, Finch. You have the eye for order, and so you notice when the order is broken. A photograph of Monsieur Armitage removed, examined, and replaced. It is most curious. We have, you see, a theme. He is the man who vanishes from photographs, and yet he leaves them behind like shadows of himself. Always the image. It tells the story." Mrs. Latimer drew in a sharp breath, but when Poirot's gaze flicked to her, she masked it quickly. The Colonel looked puzzled, Eleanor confused, Lionel skeptical. Only Finch remained impassive. Poirot rose, pacing slowly across the rug, his hands clasped behind his back. Step by step, the picture clarifies. We have a man, Charles Armitage, who lived by charm, by speculation, by promises. He left behind him those who admired him, those who despised him, those who feared him. And now he leaves behind only the space where once he stood. But spaces, mes amis, do not remain empty. They draw the eye, they demand to be filled. And so we shall discover what has been placed in that space, and by whom. He paused before the window once more, drawing back the curtain just enough to let the misty twilight seep into the room. Tomorrow, when the light returns, we shall examine the grounds, the orangery, the terrace, the garden paths. Tonight we shall examine instead the mind, for it is there, in the little contradictions, the hesitations, that we find the truth. A man may vanish from a photograph, but he cannot vanish from the memory of those who stood beside him, and it is in those memories that I shall find him again. He let the curtain fall and turned back to them, his gaze steady and unyielding. I shall speak with each of you, alone, in turn, and I warn you, mes amis, concealment will avail you nothing. The little grey cells, they are patient. They see beyond the veil. One by one, your truths will come forth, and with them, the truth of Monsieur Armitage's fate. The drawing room seemed to contract around them, the fire hissing in its grate, the shadows lengthening on the walls. None dared speak. Each guest felt as though a hand had closed upon their shoulder, that the time for evasion was drawing to an end. Poirot's eyes lingered a moment longer on the group, then softened with the faintest of smiles. Courage, mes amis. It is not yet the end, but it is the beginning of the end. And for some, that may be more terrible than the disappearance itself. The clock struck the hour, solemn and inexorable. The sound seemed to echo through the hall, and in its wake each heart beat faster. For in that instant they knew that though the gentleman had vanished from the photograph, he had not vanished from the reckoning that was to come. The drawing-room dispersed slowly under Poirot's command, each guest retreating with the unease of school-children summoned one by one to a stern master. Poirot insisted on speaking to them privately, and though no one dared refuse, the tension of anticipation weighed heavily on them all. The first he called was Mrs. Latimer, whose composure seemed most carefully constructed, as though she had rehearsed her part for an audience. She entered the small morning room where Poirot waited, its pale blue walls lending an air of delicate civility to what was, in truth, an interrogation. He stood by the writing desk, hands clasped neatly, and gestured her to a seat. "Madame, I will not weary you with long preambles. I will ask instead one simple question, and you will answer me with truth, n'est-ce pas? What was the true nature of your acquaintance with Monsieur Armitage?" Mrs. Latimer's smile was cool, practiced. "I have already told you, monsieur. Casual society meetings, no more than that. He was a man who enjoyed attention, and I am a woman accustomed to being observed. That is all." Poirot leaned forward, his voice silken. "And yet, madame, last night when you spoke, your hand went always to your locket. You tell us it once held the portrait of your late husband. Très bien. But why then did I see upon closer inspection this morning a faint ridge in the velvet of the setting, an outline larger, different from the miniature it now contains? That locket has held something else more recently, has it not?" Her eyes widened, the first crack in her poise. "You examine even the trinkets of a lady?" "Everything, madame, order and disorder both. They tell me the story. I suggest to you that once that locket contained the photograph of Monsieur Armitage." A silence fell between them. Her lips pressed together, her fingers twined tightly until at last she exhaled. "For a time, yes. He flattered me, persuaded me. I allowed myself, foolishly, to be taken in. But when I understood the sort of man he was, I removed it. It meant nothing save that I did not care to admit how nearly I had been deceived." Poirot inclined his head gently. "Merci, madame. That is already much. Do not fear. It is not a crime to be deceived. It is only dangerous when one deceives in return." She stiffened, but he dismissed her courteously, and she swept from the room, her perfume lingering behind her. Poirot allowed himself a moment to adjust the crease of his cuff before calling for Colonel Godfrey. The colonel entered briskly, his boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. He sat with the air of a man braced for battle. Poirot regarded him with mild interest. "Colonel, you spoke of your quarrel with Monsieur Armitage. Tell me, did you never consider that his ventures might touch more closely upon your own affairs than you wished?" The colonel's mustache bristled. "I told you, he sought to lure me into a damned swindle. I refused. That was the end of it." "Ah, but it was not the end, was it? You lost money through him once before, did you not? A smaller sum, perhaps, but enough to sting the pride." The colonel flushed, and his fists clenched. "That was years ago, a railway in Canada. He claimed to have insider knowledge. I was fool enough to believe him. I did not repeat the error." Poirot spread his hands. "And so the resentment grew. A soldier's pride is not easily soothed when it is wounded by a charlatan. Last night did you not feel the urge to confront him, to demand satisfaction?" The colonel's jaw tightened, but he muttered, "I may have said a word or two, but I am no murderer." Poirot's eyes softened. "No, mon colonel. Not a murderer, perhaps, but a man who despises another can still wish him gone. That is also a clue. The colonel rose stiffly, unwilling to linger, and Poirot allowed him to go without further challenge. He noted the detail carefully and rang for Lionel. Lionel slouched into the room, attempting to carry an air of disdainful ease, though his eyes betrayed unease. Poirot smiled at him with almost paternal patience. "Monsieur Lionel, you are clever with the chemicals, n'est-ce pas? The darkroom, it is your kingdom, but I must know, was it truly the flawless process you claim? Or did you perhaps, intentionally or otherwise, tamper with what the plate should have shown?" Lionel flicked his cigarette case open and shut. "You suggest I doctored the negative. Preposterous. What purpose would it serve?" Poirot's mustache twitched. Purpose, perhaps to amuse, perhaps to discredit, perhaps even to conceal. Remember, monsieur, it is in the dark room that one may erase what the eye has seen. A shadow here, a smudge there, and poof, the gentleman, he vanishes. Lionel's bravado faltered. "I did nothing of the kind. I swear it. If the image failed to show him, it was some quirk of the process, a freak of light." Poirot leaned close. "And yet, monsieur, I've spoken with Finch. He tells me the water you used in the tray smelled faintly not of the usual chemicals, but of something sharper, something acrid. He has the nose, that man. He notices. What did you add, Lionel?" Lionel's eyes darted. Only a little solution to quicken the developing. It was harmless." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured, "and perhaps not. For the photograph, it is a fragile thing. One drop too much and a man is wiped away." Lionel muttered a denial, but his composure was broken. Poirot dismissed him with a wave of the hand, and he left with a swagger more force than before. Eleanor entered last, pale, her eyes shadowed. She stood instead of sitting as though she feared to be trapped. Poirot's voice softened. "Mademoiselle, I shall not torment you. I ask only this. Monsieur Armitage, he promised you a future. Did you ever suspect that this promise was false?" Her breath caught and tears shone in her eyes. "Once, yes. Last night. He spoke to me before the photograph. He said we must leave soon, that he had enemies, that I must trust him and follow him without question. But there was something in his eyes. It frightened me. It was as if he had already decided everything, and I was but an accessory to his plan. I told him I was not sure I could bear it." Poirot nodded gravely. "And after that, he vanished." She pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob, and fled before he could say more. Poirot stood alone in the room, the ticking clock the only sound. He adjusted his tie, reflecting. Each had given him something. A hidden attachment, an old quarrel, a deception, a fear. Threads tangled yet beginning to form a pattern. When at last he returned to the drawing room, the company looked at him with a mixture of hope and dread. Poirot took his seat once more, his expression unreadable, and said quietly, "The picture, mes amis, grows clearer. But still, a detail eludes me. There is something small, something very small that will explain all. Until I find it, we wait. But do not deceive yourselves. The truth, it is very near." The fire sputtered. The shadows stretched, and though no word was spoken, every soul in the room felt the tightening grip of inevitability. The lamps burned lower as the evening advanced, and the guests of Ashcombe Hall carried themselves with the weary caution of actors too long upon a stage, fearful of missing their cue under the scrutiny of an exacting director. Poirot sat immobile in the center of the drawing-room, a small island of composure amidst a tide of nervous glances. His head bent slightly, fingertips pressed together. He seemed as still as the marble busts in the gallery, yet every shift of a hand, every rustle of silk, every shallow breath passed into the ledger of his observation. It was Lionel who broke first, unable to bear the silence. He lit another cigarette and sent a thin coil of smoke spiraling upward. "Well, Poirot, what do you make of it now? We've paraded our little confessions before you, one after another. Surely you must see that if Charles Armitage is gone, he took himself away. Why linger over our lives as though we are all conspirators?" Poirot did not look up. "Because, monsieur, when a man disappears, he leaves a shape behind. It is as when a heavy vase is lifted from a table. The ring of dust shows where it stood. Monsieur Armitage has left many such marks, and they point not outward, into the storm, but inward, to this house. Do not doubt it." Colonel Godfrey gave a short, derisive laugh. "You'll chase shadows until kingdom come. Armitage was a rogue, yes, but rogues vanish every day. It's what they do." Poirot lifted his head then, his eyes bright with sudden sharpness. "A rogue, yes. But tell me, mon colonel, does a rogue leave his luggage untouched, his stick behind, his coat neatly hung? No, a rogue prepares his vanishing act with care. Here there is no preparation, there is only rupture, an absence made in haste. That is not the work of a man who plans, but of a man whose plan was interrupted." Mrs. Latimer's hands, folded too perfectly upon her lap, twitched against the lace of her cuff. "If he was interrupted, then by whom? Surely not one of us. We may quarrel, we may resent, but to spirit a man away, it is unthinkable." Poirot's gaze rested upon her, kind yet unwavering. "Unthinkable, madame? And yet it has been thought, and more, it has been done. Whether in deceit or in desperation, someone here has already crossed that line. The photograph tells us so. It is not merely a curiosity. No, it is a confession written in silver and shadow." Eleanor started, her breath quickening. "But how? How could a photograph confess anything?" Poirot leaned back, his voice dropping to that soft cadence that drew listeners closer. "Because, mademoiselle, it shows not only what is present, but what is absent. When Monsieur Lionel developed it, he expected to see all the faces arranged as he had composed them. Instead, there was a void. Such accidents may happen, but rarely. Too rarely. A smear, a blur, yes. But a perfect absence? Non. It is as deliberate as an erasure upon a page. Someone wished Charles Armitage removed, not only from this house, but from its record." Lionel dropped his cigarette into the tray with a sharp hiss. "I told you. I altered nothing." Poirot raised a hand. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the alteration was made before the plate ever touched the chemicals. Perhaps the act of developing only revealed the truth that someone else had engineered. Consider, mes amis, who stood nearest to Armitage in the group? Who could have leaned close, shifted a chair, drawn a shadow across his form? Who could have prepared for his absence even as he smiled for the lens?" The fire spat a burst of sparks, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Finch's measured voice entered the stillness. "Mr. Poirot, if I may. I've served in this house many years. I know its patterns, its quiet corners. Last night, when I closed the gallery, I thought I heard movement near the servants' stair. I went to look, but found nothing. This morning, however, I noticed that a small side door there, usually locked, bore a smear of mud along its frame. It could be from a boot. If Mr. Armitage left the house unseen, it might have been by that way." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Finch, toujours précis. Yes, a side door, forgotten by most, remembered by one. And yet, why no coat, no stick, no luggage? Unless, of course, he did not leave of his own accord, but was led." Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth. "Then he is dead. He must be dead." Poirot's gaze softened. "Patience, mademoiselle. To vanish is not the same as to perish, but what is certain is this. If he left by the side door, someone here knew it, for the mud is not his alone. It is a trace of company." The colonel surged to his feet. "Enough of this theatre. If you suspect someone, name them. I will not sit here while you play games with our nerves." Poirot remained seated, unruffled. "Patience, mon colonel. The truth, it ripens slowly. If plucked too soon, it is bitter. But very soon, I promise you, I shall gather you all together, and then the whole will be revealed. For now, I study the little things. A locket once altered. A quarrel long remembered. A chemical too sharp in the dark room. A promise whispered in secret. A door left ajar. These, they are pieces of a mosaic, and already the pattern emerges. But to see it complete, we must wait a little longer." He rose, pacing with neat, deliberate steps. "Tonight you will remain here, all of you. I shall not risk another disappearance. Tomorrow, when the grounds are searched, when the photograph is compared with what was disturbed in the gallery, when I've asked one more question of each of you, then, mes amis, we shall have the truth. I give you my word." The air in the room grew heavier still, for though Poirot had named no one, each guest felt the shadow fall close upon themselves. Mrs. Latimer's fingers tightened over her locket as though it might choke her. Eleanor trembled, eyes wide and haunted. Lionel drummed a nervous rhythm against his chair, the bravado gone from his smile. The colonel scowled fiercely, more to mask unease than from indignation. And Finch, still and grave, betrayed nothing, though in his silence there was the weight of knowledge. Poirot returned to his seat, serene once more, and folded his hands. "It is late. We shall rest. But remember, mes amis, the gentleman who vanished from the photograph has not vanished from memory, nor from truth. He is here, in this house, in this circle, in the very air we breathe. And tomorrow his story will be told." The clock struck again, the sound echoing through the hall like a solemn toll. No one spoke. They rose reluctantly, dispersing into the shadowed corridors, each burdened by their own fear of what the morning light would reveal. And Poirot, left alone with the fire's embers, allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied of smiles, for he knew already that the solution lay not in what was lost, but in what had been made to vanish. The night closed around Ashcombe Hall with the oppressive stillness of a secret withheld. Though each guest retired to their rooms, there was little true rest. Eleanor lay wakeful, staring at the ceiling, her mind haunted by the promise Charles had whispered to her, and by Poirot's gentle yet implacable probing. Mrs. Latimer sat before her mirror, her locket clutched in her palm, her face pale beneath the powder, as though she stared at a version of herself she no longer recognized. Colonel Godfrey smoked furiously until the room was thick with haze, his thoughts circling the humiliation Armitage had once inflicted upon him. Lionel paced, restless, unable to decide whether to despise Poirot or fear him, while Finch moved through his duties with mechanical exactitude, extinguishing lamps, checking locks, his expression unreadable. Poirot alone seemed to embrace calm. In his guest chamber, he polished his shoes, brushed his suit, and set his watch neatly upon the table, all with that scrupulous attention to order which was his anchor. When at last he lay down, it was not to sleep but to think, his little grey cells arranging and rearranging the pattern until the faint outline of truth began to glow. He did not hurry. He never hurried. He knew the morning would bring clarity. And so it did. The mist of the previous day had thinned, leaving the garden sodden but visible beneath a pale sun. Poirot breakfasted lightly, then summoned the company to assemble once more in the drawing-room. They gathered reluctantly, each pale with fatigue, each aware that the little Belgian's eyes had already begun to strip away their pretenses. "My friends," he began, his voice soft but carrying. "This morning I walked a little. I examined the terrace, the orangery, the path by the side door. The ground tells a story, if one is willing to read it. And what it tells us is this. Monsieur Armitage did not vanish into the night alone. There were two sets of prints upon the wet earth, one heavy, one lighter. And the heavier, they halted. They did not return. The lighter, They returned alone. A gasp broke from Eleanor, and she pressed her handkerchief to her lips. The Colonel's fists clenched upon his knees. Mrs. Latimer gave a sharp little intake of breath. Lionel muttered something inaudible, and Finch's eyes flickered once, then steadied. Poirot continued, unruffled. "You see, it is already plain. Monsieur Armitage left the house not willingly, but with company, and that company returned without him. This is the fact. The question is, who?" He paused, letting the silence stretch, then rose and crossed to the mantel where the photograph still leaned against the porcelain clock. He lifted it, holding it so the morning light fell across the surface. "Observe, mes amis. Each of you stands clearly. Each is fixed, but here, where Monsieur Armitage should be, nothing. An emptiness. Yet notice, the chair beside him is shifted, closer to the hearth than it ought to be. Who sat there?" Mrs. Latimer's lips parted, then pressed together again. Poirot's eyes met hers. "It was you, madame. And so I must ask, why was your chair moved? Did you wish to obscure him, to create the shadow that would erase him?" Her composure fractured. I did not—" She faltered, then raised her chin. "I will not be accused on the basis of shadows." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Not only shadows, madame. There is also your locket, once holding his likeness, your history with him, your rejection, and yet, though your motives are clear, your nature, none, it does not fit the violence required." He turned, his gaze sharp, to the Colonel. "Colonel Godfrey, you despised him, you lost to him money, pride, honor, and you confessed that last night he muttered after leaving the card table. What if he spoke of you, eh? What if he threatened to expose your losses, to shame you once more? Would you not follow him, confront him?" The Colonel's face reddened, his mustache bristling. "By God, Poirot, I would have struck him if he had tried, but I did not kill him. I'm a soldier, not an assassin." Poirot nodded, calm as ever. "Just so. You would have struck, but in the open, not in the dark. Your pride, it is too great for secret deeds. No, mon Colonel, you are not the one." His eyes shifted now to Lionel, who shifted uneasily in his chair. "Monsieur Lionel, you had the control of the darkroom, the chemicals. It would have been the simplest thing to tamper with the plate, to ensure that Monsieur Armitage's image would not appear. Why? To amuse yourself? To draw suspicion away from something else? And then, in the confusion, to aid in his removal." Lionel's voice cracked as he protested. "I only wished to speed the process. I admit, I added more than I should, but it was no deliberate trick. As for leading him out, nonsense. Why would I?" Poirot's mustache twitched. "Because, monsieur, you are careless, but not cruel. You seek drama, not murder. You erased him from the photograph, yes, but not from life. That task belongs to another." The silence grew heavy. Poirot turned slowly, his gaze resting at last on Finch, who stood with his usual dignity at the edge of the room. "Finch," he said softly, "you are the servant who sees all. You knew of the side door, you noticed the smear of mud, you observed the altered photograph in the gallery. You are precise, loyal to order, and yet you are the one who led Monsieur Armitage into the night, are you not?" A collective breath escaped the others. Finch did not flinch. His face remained grave, his voice calm. "Why should I, sir? What cause would I have?" Poirot's eyes glittered. "Cause? Because Monsieur Armitage, in his arrogance, forgot you were a man, not a piece of furniture. He slighted you, humiliated you. He treated you as less than human. But more than that, he threatened your position here. Did he not demand of Lady Willoughby that you be dismissed? I found the letter upon her desk this morning, unsigned but in his hand, urging her to rid herself of a butler, too meddlesome, too observant. You knew, Finch, that if he remained, you would be gone." For the first time, Finch's expression shifted. His jaw tightened, his hands clasped behind his back with greater force. "I did not kill him." "No," Poirot said gently. "You did not. But you did lead him out, at his own command, perhaps, or at your persuasion. And when he was gone, you returned alone. What befell him after? That is the question still to be answered. But the hand that opened the side door, that guided him into the storm, that hand was yours." The room quivered with the shock of revelation. Eleanor gave a strangled cry. Mrs. Latimer's hand flew to her mouth. Lionel muttered a curse, and the colonel surged to his feet, glaring at Finch as though he were an enemy soldier. Finch, however, remained steady, his voice low. "If it was as you say, then may God judge me. But I swear when I left him, he was alive." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he regarded the butler with profound intensity. Then he inclined his head. "Alive, yes, but not safe. And so, mes amis, we come nearer the truth. Monsieur Armitage vanished not by magic, not by trickery of a camera, but by the hand of one among us. And very soon you shall hear precisely how and why." The fire flared as though in answer, and the hush that followed was deeper than any before. Each knew that the end of concealment was upon them, and that Poirot, with his little grey cells, would soon lay bare the whole of it. The household assembled once more in the drawing-room, summoned by Poirot at the hour he decreed. The fire was lit, the curtains drawn against the damp twilight, and every guest sat in uneasy expectation. Poirot stood before the mantel, his small figure precise and composed, the photograph resting against the porcelain clock as though it were both evidence and symbol. His eyes travelled over them all, lingering a fraction longer upon each face, until the silence was absolute. "My friends," he began, his voice low but carrying with perfect clarity, "at last we arrive. The gentleman who vanished from the photograph has not vanished from the truth. The facts, they are now in order, and the little grey cells, they are satisfied." He lifted the photograph. "This, you see, was no accident. A flaw in the process, but a flaw encouraged by deliberate hand. Monsieur Lionel, you added too much of the solution, and so you erased not only a blemish but a man. You thought it an experiment, a quirk of artistry. You did not mean harm, but you gave to another the perfect opportunity. A photograph without Armitage, a suggestion already planted that he was gone." Lionel's protest faltered under Poirot's raised hand. "Next, the side door. The mud told us the truth. 2 men went out, 1 returned. Finch, it was you who guided him there. You did so not in malice, but in obedience. For you were summoned. Monsieur Armitage intended to leave the house unseen, to vanish by his own plan, and he required your assistance. You led him as commanded, believing he would step into the mist and reappear with explanations. But no, it was not so." Poirot's gaze sharpened, sweeping to Mrs. Latimer. "Madame, you were waiting. You had once been his admirer, perhaps his confidant. He had betrayed you, left you with ridicule where once there was promise. When he sought to vanish, he sought also your silence, but you would not grant it. You met him in the garden, words were exchanged, heated. He threatened to expose you, perhaps a letter, perhaps a debt. And in that moment, you acted. A push, a blow, perhaps only meant to wound. But Monsieur Armitage struck his head upon the stone at the base of the orangery. Death came swiftly. Mrs. Latimer gasped, her hand rising to her throat, her composure collapsing like glass. "No, I did not mean—" Poirot's moustache twitched. "Just so, madame. You did not mean to kill. You meant only to silence. But the silence became permanent. And then, you were clever. You returned through the garden, rejoined the others. Composed yourself. The photograph, the confusion, it would serve as veil. The body, you thought, would never be found, hidden in the cold earth near the orangery where the storm had softened the soil." The colonel sprang up. "Good God, Poirot, are you certain?" Poirot inclined his head. "Certain, mon colonel. This morning I saw it, a patch of earth freshly turned, where no gardener had labored in months. It will yield its secret when the spade is applied. And that secret is Monsieur Armitage." Eleanor gave a cry and buried her face in her hands. Lionel sat frozen, and Finch closed his eyes as though in weary confirmation. Mrs. Latimer rose unsteadily, the locket falling from her hand, the chain breaking. "He ruined me," she whispered. "He promised everything and left me nothing. I only wanted him to listen, to feel for once the cost of his betrayals. But he laughed, even as I begged. And then it was too late." Poirot regarded her gravely. "It is always too late, madame, when anger rules. Murder, it is the most final of arguments, and now justice must follow." Lady Willoughby, white and trembling, rang for the authorities. Mrs. Latimer sank into her chair, her elegance crumbling into despair. The others sat in shocked silence, each realizing how near suspicion had hovered above their own heads, how delicate the line between guilt and innocence had become in this house. Poirot set the photograph once more upon the mantel, its empty space forever a reminder. "You see, mes amis, it is not in the grand gestures that truth is found. It is in the little things, the creak of a board, the smear of mud, the clasp of a necklace, the shift of a chair. From these, the whole picture forms. Monsieur Armitage wished to vanish from his debts, from his promises, from his shame, and in a way he succeeded. But he did not reckon with the rage of one he wronged, and so he vanished not only from the photograph, but from life. The fire burned lower, the clock ticked steadily, and Poirot smoothed his moustache with fastidious care. It is finished, and perhaps when you think of him again, you will remember not only his charm, but the emptiness he left behind. For in the end, it is emptiness, not brilliance, that is the legacy of such a man." He glanced toward the window where the mist pressed faintly against the glass, then turned to Lady Willoughby with a small bow. "And now, madame, I take my leave. Ashcombe Hall will return to its order, and I to mine. Such is the way of life, is it not?" And with that, Hercule Poirot departed, leaving behind a silence heavy with relief and sorrow, and a house that would forever remember the gentleman who vanished from the photograph.